You heard it right. It's not an exaggeration to say that U.S. federal agencies have spread evangelical Protestant Christianity in the Americas as a part of a long-term psychological operation. In fact, that might be an understatement because this strategy helped oil companies and dictators displace and murder countless people. A problem for the powerful. Our story begins in the 1960s when a movement spread across Latin America. Catholic priests, nuns, and laypeople began reading the Bible with the poor in small base communities, practicing and teaching what came to be known as liberation theology. Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, whose book, A Theology of Liberation, named the movement, argued that the gospel required solidarity with the poor and resistance to the structures that kept them poor. If there is no friendship with them and no sharing of the life of the poor, then there is no authentic commitment to liberation, because love exists only among equals. In the Bible, poverty is a scandalous condition inimical to human dignity and therefore contrary to the will of God. The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order. Leonardo Boff in Brazil taught that faith without a commitment to justice was empty. How are we to be Christian in a world of destitution and injustice? There can only be one answer. We can be followers of Jesus and true Christians only by making common cause with the poor and working out the gospel of liberation. So the criticisms made of liberation theology by those who judge it on a purely conceptual level, devoid of any real commitment to the oppressed, must be seen as radically irrelevant. Liberation theology responds to such criticism with just one question. What part have you played in the effective and integral liberation of the oppressed? In El Salvador, thinkers like John Sobrino and Ignacio Ellacuría related the suffering of the poor to the passion of Christ directly, and the sin of oppressors to the sins for which he was crucified. The crucified people, that is, the poor, are the historical continuation of Yahweh's servant, whom the sin of the world continues to deprive of his human face. The powerful of this world continue to strip them of everything, to snatch everything from them, even their lives, especially their lives. Jesus takes a very different approach to each group. He offers salvation to all and makes demands of all, but in a very different way. He directly demands a radical conversion of the oppressor, an active cessation from oppressing. For these, the coming of the kingdom is above all a radical need to stop being oppressors. These theologians did not invent liberation theology from above. They put into words what Christian-based communities were discovering for themselves as they studied Scripture in the shadow of military dictatorships, land monopolies, and US-backed elites. These communities did not just pray together. They examined the conditions of their lives. They asked why their societies were structured to benefit a small ruling class and what it meant that Jesus identified with the poor. Liberation theology took those questions seriously and treated them as a call to collective action, offering ordinary people tools to interpret their own oppression and to organize for land reform, workers' rights, literacy, and democracy. You might see the problem with this for the wealthy, the greedy, the powerful, aka the US empire. This movement encouraged those who suffered most under the existing political order to demand they be treated with basic respect. By the late 1960s, U.S. intelligence assessments characterized progressive Catholic clergy as an increasingly disruptive force, whose work threatened to establish political order in Latin America. A 1969 CIA memorandum warned that liberation-oriented priests' sermons and writings have already aroused the concern of conservative church officials and military leaders, and predicted some clergy may be driven into alignment with leftist political groups. By 1971, President Nixon identified the deterioration of the attitude of the Catholic Church as the single most important event in Latin America over the previous decade, worrying that priests were now standing with the peasants and workers against the oligarchs and the armies. Yes, he actually said that. The 1980 Santa Fe document, prepared for the incoming Reagan administration, declared that liberation theology represented Marxist-Leninist forces using the church as a political weapon against private property and productive capitalism, and called for U.S. foreign policy to mount a counterattack on, and not merely react against, liberation theology. The U.S. did use direct violence to manage its problem, and we'll talk about that. But with liberation theology's proponents having some protection from the Vatican, the US couldn't just take out everyone it disliked, at least. So it chose an additional approach to liberation theology. It would dilute, replace, and counter-program it. How might it do this? As a 1969 report by Republican politician and eventual vice president Nelson Rockefeller said, since the Catholic Church in Latin America raises the consciousness of the people, the U.S. should give support to fundamentalist Christian groups. As I'm filming this, Minnesota is in the middle of Ice Out of Minnesota, a general strike which appears to be the largest general strike in the country in at least a generation. Unions and progressive faith leaders are leading the charge in an effort to show the capitalist class that if the occupying army that is ICE continues its invasion of American cities, big business will suffer. Minnesotan resistance is being reported all over, but tell me why only 8 sources have reported on this story about their action being a general strike. We can easily see here that mostly local Minnesota sources are covering this, with some of the only coverage from outside of the state coming from communistusa.org, an independent left-leaning source. That gives us some insights into the priorities of national media, I think. I was able to see this broader picture of the strike's media coverage and find local and independent sources covering the story in just seconds because I use Ground News, an independent app and website I use every day in my real life, recommend to my friends, and have partnered with for years now. Their platform organizes every published perspective on an issue in one place with data on each outlet's political bias, credibility, and financial incentives. I use their Vantage plan, and you can get 40% off that plan by going to ground.news/skeptic. Right-leaning sources are barely covering the story, but luckily, Ground News has a great feature called their Blind Spot feed, which is dedicated to surfacing important stories that are being completely ignored by one side of the political spectrum or another. So right-leaning Ground News users stand a way better chance of seeing the story than they would without Ground News. Having this feature right there on your phone or in your inbox provides a ton of value, especially in our incredibly chaotic media landscape. So, get Ground News to easily find quality, independent reporting on stories that actually matter. Go to ground.news/skeptic or scan the QR code on your screen. There you can get the same Vantage plan I use every day for just $5 a month. Taking advantage of these tools is a great step toward reading the news skeptically and staying properly informed. By signing up, you support my sponsor, which in turn supports my channel, so thank you. Missionaries versus indigenous people. The Summer Institute of Linguistics, or SIL, is the academic wing of Wycliffe Bible translators. SIL specializes in going into remote indigenous regions, studying unwritten languages, creating alphabets, and then translating the Bible. They are trained linguists, many with graduate degrees. Their work, on the surface, is scholarly and humanitarian. Okay, I mean, that description of their work is full of red flags to me, and probably to most of my viewers, but to a lot of people, Bible translation for indigenous people somehow does not sound inherently sketchy.
We know that someone is going to come by here and live in our village someday and tell us about God, and we want to be ready.
Well, during the Cold War, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, I'm going to call it USAID in this video, fewer syllables, a core part of the U.S. soft power apparatus, put massive funding and other resources in SIL's hands. Sometimes USAID gave missionaries money directly through bilingual education and agricultural programs. They also gave SIL military equipment, including helicopters retired from Vietnam, allowing evangelized pilots to quite literally act as soldiers for Christ in the most remote areas of the world. Most of the time, though, resources flowed from USAID to missionaries through a third party. USAID gave money to state agencies in Latin America, who then gave contracts to SIL. These copious resources allowed the largely Protestant evangelical missionaries to reach huge numbers of people with a message very different from that of liberation theology. The evangelical Protestant spiritual paradigm, as you may know if you were raised evangelical like me, focuses on the importance of obedience and individual spiritual development, and ignores any structural factors when contemplating matters of justice, fairness, or morality more generally. Like, imagine a wealthy person acquired the land you live on, and now you can't control the resources you need to live. Evangelical Protestantism might teach you to say, I guess I'll just turn to God in prayer, maybe one day he'll even bless me with wealth like that so I can buy land too. No exaggeration, one Mexican historian records that an SIL missionary to Chiapas, Mexico, explicitly condemned the indigenous people's struggle for their own land, telling them that it was a sin of envy. Meanwhile, liberation theology would teach you to examine whether a social and political system which allows wealthy people to just dominate the poor like this is just in the first place. So when USAID helped SIL reach indigenous people in Guatemala, Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador with literacy programs loaded with biblical stories, the effect was to preempt the formulation of class consciousness and to instill an ideology of compliance with the powerful. In Guatemala, SIL coincidentally operated in areas where leftist guerrillas were active, and the military government, backed by the US, by the way, gave SIL extraordinary freedom and protection because they saw the missionaries as tools to pacify indigenous resistance. As anthropologist David Stoll wrote in his study of SIL and its global impact, members of SIL typically feel that Indian militancy is communist-inspired and therefore under satanic influence try to propagate a higher loyalty, which precludes participation by converts who might otherwise find some basis for unity, and teach that the government is divinely ordained. So y'all already know this. I was raised to believe that anything to the left of the far right was communism, and that communism was satanic, and that satanic communists therefore
controlled the world outside of the church.
I always thought my Christian fundamentalist denomination, which was founded by oil barons, was solely responsible for spreading that conspiracy theory. Apparently not, though. No, the CIA also spread this one. The CIA funded networks like Trans World Radio and HCJB in Ecuador, which broadcast anti-communist sermons to areas dominated by liberation theology. With the CIA's help, HCJB was able to go from transmitting at 10 kilowatts to transmitting at 500 kilowatts, which from their elevation there in Ecuador could reach basically all of South and Central America. And they were able to build their own hydroelectric plant to power the station too. I found a book from HCJB Radio about their story. Eric can show you a little bit of it here on screen. And I read some of it for this part of the video. And I gotta say, I was not actually surprised that the very first part I read talked about how they helped vicious killer indigenous people create an orderly community of Christians. And SIL even got a mention. Also, materials from the United States Information Agency labeled liberation theologians as Marxists and were distributed directly to religious leaders in Latin America. Though the missionaries didn't just disseminate an ideology in Latin America, they became informants. Anthropologist Scott S. Robinson, writing about U.S. missionary activity in Ecuador during this period, noted that missionaries have become essential informants to the American intelligence community, particularly in resource-rich regions which strategic petroleum and mineral resources abound. Just to put into perspective how common it was for missionaries to become essential informants, a 1975 article in Christianity Today stated that overall, between 10 and 25% of America's 35,000 Protestant and 7,000 Catholic foreign missionaries have given information to intelligence authorities, observers estimate. The average would be much higher among missionaries serving in rural areas where reliable information is hard to come by and in places where there is social and political unrest. Additionally, missionaries built infrastructure, aviation networks, airstrips, schools, all of which aided US-backed states and corporations while undermining the culture and power of indigenous people. For those of you who just like to listen to these videos and don't really look at the screen a whole lot, what's up? Hello, I am one of you. Just to let you know, there are about to be a lot of quotes coming up, so I'll try to differentiate with my tone which of these things I'm saying are quotes and which of these things I'm saying are my actual words. All right. You've been warned. If SIL linguists were zealous, as they often were, the teachers imposed an evangelical order as a condition for the schooling and other material advantages they introduced. Where necessary, the teacher-pastors concentrated dispersed populations around the schools, which tended to produce ecological and social instability. For decades, SIL told the Peruvian government that it would reconcile jungle Indians to colonization, that is, to the loss of most of their land. According to Weistrand, SIL has helped the Aguarana face a new highway and colonization by 1. Anchoring them around the bilingual schools so that they not abandon choice land and flee into the hills as the elders initially advised, 2. Convincing the teachers of the highway's benefits through new trade opportunities, and 3. By giving the Aguarana a feeling for progress in the accumulation of material goods. As that last quote indicated, missionaries also introduced foreign trade goods, clothes, medicines, vehicles, building materials, and along with them, a capitalist market economy and materialist consumerist culture to indigenous people. This meant to break indigenous traditions of reciprocity as well as their community's self-reliance. Since control over trade goods, medicine, and schooling is so basic to missionary work, it is tempting to dismiss it as a coercive economic transaction, one which simply alienates native people from their culture and induces them to accept exploitation in the image of the suffering Jesus. In the marginal situation, SIL therefore enslaves native people to the trade good. Considerable economic power is concentrated in the teacher, who becomes the agent of trade good dependency and is placed under pressure to break with the tradition of reciprocity. The population is more likely to require concentration around the school, and the evangelical order becomes a condition attached to the trade good. SIL's own aviation service, jungle aviation and radio service, or JARS, also occasionally transported state officials in regions where leftist guerrilla movements operated. JARS pilots were not CIA assets per se, but they did operate in regions otherwise inaccessible to government forces, and their cooperation was certainly mutually beneficial. Finally, as if all that's not enough, SIL missionaries actively helped oil companies and the US-backed Ecuadorian government force indigenous people in Ecuador into reservations. The evangelicals, under the strategic leadership of the more politically sophisticated SIL, supported the oil companies and an ethnocidal Ecuadorian government policy of encouraging highland homesteaders, that's referring to the missionaries, to stake out parcels of land along oil company access roads. After consultation with the Ecuadorian military, Aka converts flying above the remaining band of uncontacted kin in SIL helicopters operating on Texaco fuel were urged to put down their arms and join their evangelized kin at Rachel Saint's Reserva village. In similar frontier conditions, the American missionaries' grandfathers had pacified the American West and placed the Indians on reservations. Now, their grandchildren in the service of the same 19th century God proposed reservas for the Shuara and the Aucas. Imagine Ecuadorian native reservas, a legal entity, administered in effect by SIL missionaries. Evangelical Protestants and dictatorships. Under US-backed military dictatorships across Latin America, progressive Catholics faced serious persecution alongside the people with which they organized. In 1975, not long after Nixon's ruminations about Catholicism, Bolivia's Hugo Banzer, with advice from his Nazi security chief Klaus Barbie, urged his interior ministry to draw up a plan against liberation theology. Pareto worked closely with the CIA to draw up what would be known as the Banzer Plan, which was a direct attack on liberation theology. Bolivian intelligence, joined by the CIA and by the intelligence services of 10 other Latin American countries, began to compile dossiers on liberation theologists, to plant communist literature in churches to shut down any progressive church publication, and to arrest and expel foreign priests and nuns who believed in liberation theology. Things are about to get even heavier somehow in this video, so content warning for discussion of genocide and torture, like even a little bit more explicitly than we've already discussed. Eric, let's find a timestamp where people can skip to after that specific discussion is over. Under Brazil's military dictatorship, which the US financially supported at an unprecedented rate at that time, the state sought to assimilate and eliminate the indigenous people in order to develop the Amazon. Some Catholic clergy advocated for the rights of indigenous people, so Brazil's generals also railed against the church, even kidnapping and torturing church representatives. the regime killed at least 8,350 indigenous people during the dictatorship, according to Brazil's National Truth Commission. In 1980s El Salvador, where 26 U.S.-backed concentration camps are currently located, groups of U.S.-trained Army and National Guardsmen sexually abused and murdered Catholic nuns and priests. In Chile and across Latin America, dictator Augusto Pinochet's government and its allies, all backed by the USA at the time, carried out Operation Condor, a project which killed an estimated 50,000 civilians, disappeared 30,000 who were all presumed dead, and imprisoned 400,000 for being suspected communist sympathizers. Many thousands of these civilians were likely tortured. The United States provided the funding and inspiration for this project, and the CIA specifically instructed Latin American security forces in methods of torture and bomb construction. While all of this was happening, evangelical Protestant leaders supported these dictatorships, and they received some love in return. In December 1974, Chilean General Pinochet personally attended the dedication of the Hotebeche Pentecostal Methodist Church Cathedral in Santiago, marking the first time a Chilean head of state had ever attended a Protestant service. 2 days earlier, approximately 2,500 evangelicals had gathered to publicly pledge their support for the junta and denounce Chile's international critics. By September 1975, the Methodist Pentecostal Church had assumed the Catholic Church's traditional role of hosting the annual Te Deum service, a patriotic ceremony attended by Pinochet and other government leaders. Billy Graham, who we were all raised to revere in evangelical churches, coordinated directly with Latin American military dictatorships. Between 1962 and 1974, Graham personally met with Brazil's dictator Ernesto Geisel and other authoritarian rulers. He praised Chile's Augusto Pinochet as a great Christian leader. And then there is Efraín Rios Montt. Eric, can you please record yourself saying this dude's name with the utmost disrespect?
Yeah, Spanish names can be difficult sometimes. I can help. Here is how you pronounce that. Un genocida. Un hijo de puta. Cuya vida solo dejó muerte. Hope that helps.
Thank you. If there was a single moment when evangelical Christianity and U.S. counterinsurgency fully merged, it was this period in Guatemalan history. Rios Montt was a general who took power in a 1982 military coup. He was a born-again Pentecostal and a member of an American-affiliated charismatic church. His weekly national TV addresses sounded like sermons, mixing Bible verses with calls for obedience to God and the state. His government carried out one of the worst genocides in modern Latin American history against the Maya, and the U.S., financially and spiritually, supported him. Good old Ronald Reagan praised Montt as a man of great integrity.
I know that President Rios Montt is a man of great personal integrity and commitment.
Jerry Falwell openly supported him. Pat Robertson interviewed the dictator on his TV show, The 700 Club.
Efraín Rios Montt, who was the president there, he's a terrific guy. He was with the El Verbo Church, and they had a marvelous government.
Christian evangelist Luis Paulu told Christianity Today in 1983, "It's great to have a Christian president as a model. The hand of God appears to be upon him." Meanwhile, remember, Catholic priests who supported indigenous rights were being assassinated, disappeared, and tortured, along with countless other civilians. Rios Montt's rule was the logical end of a decades-long project. Replace politically engaged Catholicism with a politically compliant Protestantism, so that the structures of inequality remained untouched. Even today, evangelical Protestants in Latin America overwhelmingly support the same kinds of politicians which evangelical Protestants in the US support: authoritarian right-wingers. And while I would say that leftist thought and action is probably more common in South and Central America than it is in the imperial core of the United States, Catholics in these areas now also tend to lean right. So much media about American evangelicalism today, including some of my own work, to be honest, operates on the premise that it's getting worse. It's becoming more extreme. This media often also examines a supposed paradox. This faith is based on God's love, but its adherents somehow support cruel leaders. As I hope is obvious by the end of this video, though, morally permitting the extreme brutality of states and corporations is exactly what evangelical Protestant Christianity was shaped to do. It is not cruel in spite of itself. It is a permission structure for cruelty and always has been. In 2026, it is just doing to the people of the United States what it and the government of the United States have always done to people of other nations and the indigenous people who were here before me. As you may have heard the saying go, fascism is colonialism, just turned inward. This story should also teach us that evangelical Christianity is not synonymous with Christianity as a whole. This was a story about state-allied Christians helping to exterminate Christians who stand in solidarity with the oppressed. If we also want to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, we should not buy into and spread the propaganda which evangelicals enforced on others at gunpoint, that true Christianity is whatever evangelicals define it to be. We can't afford to alienate some of our historically strongest allies, progressive and leftist Christians who stand with the crucified people. This video was co-written by the excellent Colten Barnaby, a former Christian minister and evangelical missionary coordinator. You might have seen his stuff on Instagram and TikTok. I love his work, and I'm so hyped that we actually got to collab. Colten used to be on the inside of this grotesque machine of colonialism, kind of without his knowledge, and now spends his time organizing with marginalized people and speaking against imperialism. I know that he's inspired me to be much more vocal in speaking against imperialism too. I had to have him tell me his story of being in missions and then getting out, and that video is now up on my second channel.
One of the students who went on missions trips that I organized in recent years made news out of school as an adult that you might have heard of. His name was John, and John decided he wanted to reach one of the last unreached people groups in the world, in the Sentinel Islands. And he went out there and was actually killed by indigenous people that hit him with spears. And that sparked a huge debate, right? And this is the first time I've talked about this publicly. John was somebody that I knew, somebody that I mentored on the missions trips that I organized and led. And I think about that kind of impact and the damage that it does.
Thank you so much, Colten, for working with me to adapt a piece from your Substack for this. The original article is linked in the description for you all to check out. You should follow his Substack. It's really good. As you guys might have noticed, there's this cute little pillow in the background. Recently, I hosted an event at the Atheist Community of Austin, and a new friend who watches the channel gave this to me. Like the guy made this for me. It's if you don't realize, my little icon logo is it's a tomato, and the joke is like, oh, there's not actually a genetically modified tomato on the market, and yeah, whatever. This is my logo, and now it's a pillow, and in my background, it's really, really cool. I think this is super cute. Thank you so much for this. Thank you for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support, and praise be unto Our Lady, River, my top patron and the official savior of this channel. If you want to support my work, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.